Well, hello, welcome to Kokoro Conversations. We're so glad that you are here. In Kokoro Conversations, Alex and I, we take time out of our week to just talk through some of the topics that came up over the summer when we were filming the episodes of Kokoro. And our hope is that by kind of getting into the nitty-gritty of some of these topics and thinking about them in a little bit more depth, it will help you all to be a little bit more intentional about how you live your lives, because Kokoro at its core is really all about intentionality. So today, the topic we are delving into is an interesting one, mythology. And so I wanted to start by asking Alex, what is a personal myth that has had an impact on your life?
All right, so when I was thinking about this, I thought, I want to do the picture thing again. We're going to go back to exposure therapy like we did last time. And so I have some pictures that I brought along for the myths that we're going to be talking about, at least on my end of things.
Sure.
All right, so I'm going to start with this myth right here. So what is this myth referring to? Do you know what that is?
Oh, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So very much this is just like a concept that you hear about all the time, that people talk about constantly in our culture. And what's interesting is that originally this idea was actually meant as an impossibility, that it's actually like you're watching the guy do it right here. You cannot pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Like that's the whole point, is that you can't do it on your own. And I think one of the big myths that we've somehow bought into over the years in our society, and it's been a big myth that has driven my life for a long time until I kind of woke up to the fact that it's not true, which is that a person is entirely responsible for their own outcome in life. It doesn't matter what other people do. It only matters what you do and the effort that you put in to get the outcome, and that ultimately you are the captain of your own destiny. And so I think that for me in particular, I believed in that for a long time because I worked really hard and I achieved a lot of things, and I thought, yes, I am the one who did this, not really putting into perspective all of the resources that were behind me getting there. I mean, being born into the family I've been born into, I don't know about you, but for me, more and more have I realized that in spite of some of the really hard things I went through, how very fortunate I was to be born into the family I was born into versus other families that might have similar circumstances but with far less resources.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've considered when I've dissected this idea of pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps is we have to understand that there are some people who don't even get boots or straps at all. I mean, and it's interesting, the whole idea can fall apart when you realize that it's based on a fundamental assumption that people have something to pull from. And like you said, it's not possible. But I can remember in like high school English class reading Of Mice and Men, which was basically a dissection of this idea of being able to create the myth of the American dream in your own life. How it's a myth. It's not real. And sadly, it's a myth that sometimes causes a lot of harm.
Yeah, so when somebody comes out of poverty and they make it, we kind of hail them as the example of what America is all about. Oh, look at what they did. What we don't think about in those circumstances is how rare that is. And we don't ask the question, why is it so rare? If it really was something that was possible for anyone, then people who are born into poverty would be making it all the time, which they aren't. So I think that what that points to is that it is the exception, not the rule, that a person has the ability to come from nothing and make something out of themselves. More often than not, people who are successful come from backgrounds where they at least have some resources at their disposal, or even if they don't have resources, they have a network of people who are supporting them along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the interesting part about any story that we see where we see someone climbing a ladder and achieving great feats is we often don't see all of the struggle that it takes to get there. And often there's a lot of loss accrued. And I can think of I've been amazed because on my mom's side of the family in particular, there's a real history of poverty. And she has been able to make a life for herself. But I know, I don't think I got the whole picture as a child. I would hear these bits and pieces of like, oh, this is how we grew up. It was really hard. And then over time, I've learned about the struggle that took place over time. And some of the other kind of little bits of, honestly, like, yes, my mom worked very hard. I know that. But there were little bits of luck as well. I mean, things that not every person gets the opportunity to have. And the reality is that I think a lot of people think that with that image that's so idealized, they think like, well, I should just be able to climb the ladder and make myself a success without struggle. Right. And the truth is, it's a struggle. It's a struggle for everyone.
It's a struggle with people who have the background to make it happen.
Absolutely.
So when you're putting somebody with none of that background, none of the learning, you know, even having, we talk about the idea of you have to have things modeled for you. And I think that's something that's really remarkable, is that just having a model of somebody who has done something before you, we don't realize how impactful that is, because both of my parents were college educated people. There was never a question that I was going to go to college, ever. And what you see statistically is that for first generation college, people going to college, for the first in their family to do it, there's a high dropout rate. Oh, yeah. Because they don't really, the family doesn't know what it takes for them to do it. They've never been there, so they can't really imagine it. And then they don't really know what it takes. So there's just a lot of things that go into what it takes to be successful. And I think that there's a lot more to this than we give it credit for, particularly those who have been successful, not realizing all the people who are under them to do it. So what is a myth that you have bought into in your life? I'm interested to know.
Yeah, well, the one that came to mind, and it's a little bit different. I bought into this idea that the best thing about me was my ability to make life easy for others, my ability to just give to people, and essentially to be easy going and to never really be a problem for other people.
Yeah, so what's the mythology kind of built around that?
I think it's this idea, and I think it's an idea that everybody has to grapple with, is this idea of like, I will always be nice, I will always be kind, and I'll never let you see me struggle. Like, I'll just always be kind of sweet and endearing and never really have a problem.
Now, is that a gendered myth in some ways?
I think it is. Yeah, I think it is gendered. And I don't know. I think every person probably wants to be easygoing and
I don't know. I think there's some people who like being jackasses, to be perfectly honest with you. I think they revel in it. So
yeah, I mean, there is something about that like self-righteousness that I think feels really good to certain people. You're probably right, but
I mean, and among men in particular, like, it's okay to be, like, we've talked about the rugged individualist who goes his own way and does his own thing and doesn't care about anybody.
Yeah.
I mean, men for a long time, I mean, you think about the 50s, like the model of like the 50s, 60s kind of man, you know, that could very much be a way of just not caring about your family. I go and I work, and there should be dinner on the table when I get home, and, you know.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's that kind of broader myth in society. I think for me, the myth morphed into a very specific idea, which is I personally am somebody who's I am not going to be the person who takes a hardline, difficult position naturally. It's just not my thing to push super hard on anything. I am very much open to lots of different ideas, it's fun for me to get creative around how we can meet multiple people's needs at once. How can we stretch and be flexible here?
How does the myth hurt you then? Because that's a great thing. That's a great thing to have, to be able to figure out how people can work together. So it's clearly caused problems, though.
It has. I mean, the myth has morphed from a positive thing to this idea that in order to be lovable or likable, I have to go along with what other people want me to do or who they want me to be. And so I uplifted for a long time these images of people who were very compassionate and kind and who just embodied this kind of like perfection to me in literature and in movies.
Who is somebody like that for you?
There are a couple that come to mind. I mean, like, to be honest, there was in the movie Matilda, which I watched a lot growing up, there was this teacher, Miss Honey, who ended up, there was a little girl, if you know the story, it's a Roald Dahl book that was made into a movie and right when I was growing up. But there's a little girl, she has this family that really does not care about her. They are not very thoughtful human beings. They care about money and TV. And she's this little girl who's super intelligent and she reads everything and she wants to go to school, whereas for her brother, that's like the worst thing in the world. And so her family just does not understand her and they tell her she's stupid all the time. And she goes to school and she has this teacher that is like the warmest, loveliest person ever. And she's sweet and kind and warm in a school that's also pretty tough.
Pretty rough. So you wanted to be that person?
I wanted to be that person that in the midst of darkness and difficulty and fear, I was the person that was going to be warm and kind.
Which isn't a bad thing, though.
No, but I think I had bought into this belief system that didn't involve any feelings but warmth. Like, and also, I mean, it's not a great example. It's just like, I would sit there and think like, well, I don't want any feelings that are contrary to that.
So I can never be upset. I can never be angry. I can never be mad. I can never be sad because that would be contrary to this type of person.
But I thought, if I'm not being super kind all the time, if I am getting upset, then I'm not likable at all.
Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, so it's sort of like any feelings beyond just this ideal, nice person, I'm not lovable that way.
I do think that that's a fascinating aspect of this, that by buying into that myth, you have to suppress a lot of emotion, which then results in ultimately feeling a lot of anger that you aren't really allowed to express because you have to embody this character or this person this idealized version of yourself that you think that you need to be in order to be lovable. So, and that's hard. I'm glad that you've been able to work through that. So
yes, I mean, still doing it. I feel it's going to take a longer time, but it wasn't as difficult as I thought it was going to be to start to see the fault lines in that myth, for sure.
That's good. Yeah. All right. So I think that your example really points to something that that this whole episode is really about, which is that myth is a really potent tool in our lives. Why do you think myths play such an important role in how we live our lives? Because clearly that myth that you bought into had a huge effect on your ability to live your life. And it actually directed your life in a very specific way. So why do you think that myths have this effect on us?
Yeah, I think the truth is that we are wired for stories. And sometimes our stories are rooted in factual information. Sometimes they're rooted in feelings, which are not facts, but they can feel like they are. And sometimes they're rooted in like just downright misleading and untrue information. And it doesn't really necessarily matter if things are not true, if they're mythical. I think that the stories still have strong impacts on our lives. It's the way we make sense of the world around us. And a lot of times we're working with pretty incomplete information. So I think that that's a big part of why it's so potent.
Well, let's jump to the story thing, because I think you're right. We take our lives and we always are understanding it through story. So when we think of our lives, we think of it in terms of a narrative, almost always. Absolutely. Where we can, we dissect, okay, so there's childhood, there's late childhood, there's our teenage years, there's young adulthood, there's adult, we move through all these stages and we can come up with narratives of things that happen to us in those times, those narratives that define who we are. Mythology is, though, a very different kind of narrative, because a mythology is a story that either we personally believe, so for you talked about a story that was very personal to you, or a story that is kind of in the ethos of the culture. That would be the Bootstraps story. Yeah. And both of those point to something that resonate deeply within us as a person, that there's something about, I think myths, the ones that we really attach ourselves to, they resonate deeply with our psychology. And there's something about them that really grapple onto us in a way that maybe another narrative might not, because those narratives, you can tell all kinds of stories, but the stories that you really relate to in a deep way are the ones that connect with your psychology. I'm a hardworking person. That's why I connect deeply with the myth of the Bootstraps person, right? Even though that's a myth and it's not true, I connect deeply with the idea of hard work and work ethic will get you far in life.
Sure.
I assume for you, right, there's this idea of being a warm, kind, loving person is something that you believe, as you said, is healing to the world, and that's deeply psychological for you to want to be able to heal people who have been harmed. There's a beauty in that. So why do you think we need that? Because I think that there's something to, I don't think that that's entirely bad that you want to heal people. I don't think it's entirely bad that I have a work ethic. The question is, so why is it, what is it doing for us, I guess? What do you think?
I think it helps us to make meaning and to like really find some purpose. I mean, in this case, if you're struggling to find motivation to do something, this myth helps you to get up in the morning and say, well, every day is an opportunity in small ways and large to keep climbing up this ladder. And then I think to the other end, it's like, well, and who am I without this? Who am I without my work ethic? Who am I without this place to go, which is like to keep climbing higher and higher up some kind of ladder of success, or to keep kind of finding some way to pick myself up and keep moving.
Well, you're right. It gives me a sense of meaning and purpose, and it tells me also, you did it. Exactly. You did it. No, all this kind of work that you did it. And it gives you, I mean, and again, that's not true, but it gives you this narrative in your mind. It feeds into a narrative, I guess, in a sense that you're special.
It's a specialness too, but I think beyond that, who wants to rely on anyone else for their success? If we enter into relationships of any kinds with people, what we know is that people will sometimes let us down. And if it's you that's responsible, then the only person you have to blame for any shortcoming is yourself. And you don't have to rely on anyone else. So the only person you have to blame when you do succeed, or the only person responsible, is you once you get up to that point.
Right. Well, let's flip it to your narrative, your myth, which is, what does that do to you? Well, I would assume that it feeds, I mean, if you're talking about sense and purpose and belonging, it feeds a sense that you are healing the world in ways that you were not given that same opportunity.
Most definitely, most definitely.
So it takes something that was taken from you, and you're giving it back to people, saying, look, this was not given to me in the way it should have been, therefore I give it to you. And it gives you, that's the specialness. You're bringing that specialness that was stripped from you back into other people's lives.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that you're like, there is this sense of specialness that comes with it. I mean, I think sometimes there has been this real feeling of purpose for me in the idea that like, well, I do have the warmth and compassion and understanding to bring to this situation that would help someone, or I am willing to deal with a person who's super difficult that other people are just totally exhausted by at this point. Like there's something that feels to me in other pieces, you're needed. And it feels good to be necessary and to be needed and to know, to be the person that people
and not just to be needed, to be an integral part of somebody's story. Because absent you, that person might not end up going down a good path or being able to succeed or doing the very things that they would need to do. So you become an important variable in their lives.
Right. And then in this case with me, it's good to want to be compassionate. It's not good to feel that you are the only thing that will help someone to actually, you're the only person patient enough and kind enough and all these things. That's like so egotistical to me hearing it. But I mean, it's not a good thing to give yourself that sense of being the only person that can help. And beyond that, I mean, whenever you aren't able to help, which happens, you do feel like a failure and you worry about your own
Right.
sense of worth. And so there's a lot on the table for sense of worthiness with both
Absolutely.
of these. So we're talking about myths and we're talking about our personal myths, but obviously throughout history, there are so many amazing myths that we find in literature and in history. So I'm wondering, are there any myths that you love specifically?
So in terms of ancient myths, I would say the one that I love the most, we'll see if you can guess what it is. I have two pictures in case you can't get the first time.
Okay.
All right, so this is the first myth. Now this might be hard. I chose two. I think that's a beautiful painting, so I wasn't sure.
Gorgeous.
So I wasn't sure if you would be able to put it together. Do you want the second shot at it?
Show me the next one.
All right, the second one you'll definitely get it.
Okay.
I know for sure. So this is the second one.
Oh my gosh, of course. Icarus. Yes. No, when I was thinking about my favorites, Icarus actually came to mind. Yeah. So this is Icarus flying too close to the sun.
Yeah. So in the story, he's trying to escape. His father helps him build these wings out of wax. And when they fly off out of the tower, his father, he says, look, just don't go, the problem, you can fly, we can get away, but just don't get too close to the sun because it will melt the feathers that are made of wax and you'll fall. And he just doesn't listen. He ends up flying too close and he ends up going down. And so this other one right here is after he's fallen to the earth and he's being taken care of, which is a really beautiful, beautiful painting.
The light in that is so perfect.
I wish that I had a better printer to really get the concept across. Now, I think the reason that I like why it resonates with me psychologically, because that's essentially what we know now. We know that if a myth resonates with you, it's because it's something deep in your psychology. I think that I do like to push myself to limits, and that to me, and I do it when I work out, I will push myself to the ultimate limit every single time, which is why, for example, when I work out with people who are in their 20s, they often, I'm 45, I'll get guys in their 20s who are like, I'd like to work out with you. They don't tend to last very long because what I ask at every workout is that you're going to your maximum. So you're pushing it to your maximum. And after a while, they're kind of like, this is really too intense for me, and I don't blame people for that because that intensity is not something that most people are willing to just invest in that way. But for me, that has always been my personality. I love to go to the point where I do fall sometimes. The beauty of this is this concept that if you're innovative, if you're a person who's always thinking, always willing to strive, that you can pretty much come up with a solution to any situation. So they're stuck, they come up with this beautiful solution, but when he goes, you have to be careful because your own ingenuity can be your demise.
Absolutely.
And I think that's something that we see again and again throughout history. I've seen it again and again throughout my life where the moment that I say to myself, wow, that was really smart. You did a good job on that. like to be able to figure that out. Sometimes I get a little too smug about my own ability to come up with ideas and thoughts.
Yeah.
And that becomes kind of the totality of everything. And what ends up happening every single time is that the moment that I kind of have that thought of where modesty goes out the window, humility goes out the window, and I say, this is great. It's back to the bootstrap. Oh, look at what you did. That's the moment that oftentimes things start to fall, relationships start to fall, and people can sense there's a change, there's an arrogance that comes with it, and egotism, as we were talking about. And so I love this myth because it reminds me your own ingenuity is a wonderful thing, but it can only get you so far, and you always need to be careful. You need to ride that line very close between your own ability and realizing that if you take it too far, you will eventually get burned.
Yes.
And could get very hurt, and also hurt other people. So
absolutely.
Yeah. So that's my ancient myth that I resonate with deeply.
Yeah. Well, and I was smiling so much because as you were explaining it, I had this memory of right around the time that I turned 23. you were like, be careful. When I was 23, I thought I knew everything.
Yeah. I really did think I knew. Yeah, now I look back and I'm like, you were an idiot. You didn't know anything.
Yeah, and I was sort of like, interesting. We'll see how that goes. And there is something about when you think you know everything, the world has a way of telling you that you don't and showing you in a very real way. But I think that's such a great explanation, and it connects well to the myth that came to mind.
Yes, what is yours?
I was thinking about Pandora's box.
Oh, interesting, yes.
I love it. And if you don't know the myth of Pandora's box, it's this idea that there's this box and the gods say, do not open the box. But Pandora, she's so curious that she has to open it up. And when the box is opened, this is kind of the beginning of, it is the reason behind the evil in the world. And honestly, you know, I love the myth because I love that Pandora is so curious. I don't think curiosity is a bad thing at all. And it's hard to not, when you're given something and you don't know what's there, it's hard to not go and seek to open that box. But what I appreciate so much about this, you know, hearing about Icarus, it connects so well to like some biblical stuff that we talked about when we talked about technology.
Yeah.
We talked about the Tower of Babel and this idea that people wanted to be as close to God as possible. And in their efforts to do that, they became quite jumbled and mixed up. And with this, I think it's such an interesting connection to other myths from different cultures, like Adam and Eve, where it's like, do not eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. They do it, and it's this way of explaining why bad things happen in the world. And I think that that is why I love the myths so much, because it shows to me that all throughout history, people have needed and longed for some kind of explanation as to why bad things happen in the world. Do I think that either myth really literally gets at why? No, but I think it points to the fact that we all have this curiosity and this desire to understand. And I think the reason it resonates so deeply with my psychology is something that I'm becoming more and more aware of as I get older, is that I like to understand something. I like to understand why someone behaved that way or the way that they did. And even if it's like not really a great reason, I just like to understand why. Even when I do something and I don't, sometimes I make an impulsive choice, I want to know why was it?
But you know, that's interesting. I have found, and I totally am on the same wavelength with you, because I find that to be fascinating. Why do people act the way they do? Why do they make the decisions they do? But what you've probably come to realize, as I have, is that most people themselves could not tell you why they made a particular decision. That is not necessarily in their lexicon of understanding of themselves. They will say, well, I was doing X, Y, Z, and it struck me at the time, or I did this and that. But the deeper, the psychological root behind why did you do that, that's the interesting thing, right? That's the thing that you want to get to, which is what's the deep reason why you're making that decision? And I think that's the beauty of psychology in some way. And I think that when you're talking about Greek myths in particular, those are myths that get at a concept of our psychology as humans, which I think they're kind of beautiful in that way, because whether they realize it or not, they're reflective of the deeper meaning behind what we do. And psychologists like Freud understood that early, where he looked at those and he said, wow, this is really reflective of something much deeper, and then he started pulling from all these myths to say, this is a larger explanation for why we do things. And they relate to kind of the behaviors that we have. So I completely relate to that idea of like in Pandora's box, which is an explanation for why is there problems in the world, or the Adam and Eve story, why are there problems? Both of those are very rich metaphors.
Yes.
For human behavior and why it went the way it did.
Sometimes we really don't, you might not think that opening a box is going to have a big impact, but it does. And I think that sometimes, like, especially because we are human beings that are often really not conscious of why we do what we do, I think that sometimes that can be a real experience where we're like, well, I did this and I wasn't expecting anything to happen, but then this big thing happened, and then you start to actually mindfully go through things and you're like, oh, I do see the cause and effect relationships between things. When I've looked back over the past 10 years of my life, I've been surprised to see these small little things that I've almost forgotten about in some ways made a huge impact on how I was feeling and ultimately the choices I made as a result. And so while I don't think that it's just opening a box that let out some sort of energy that caused all the problems we face in the world, or somebody eating a fruit from a tree, I do think that what's so fascinating is sometimes it is these behaviors that are so small and that we're so unaware of that they can be, like we talked about last week, watershed moments that have a huge impact on us.
Well, yeah, because when you get into the deeper psychology of why you do things, it can change. That is, there's kind of surface level behavior.
Yes.
So we're acting and we're trying to change that, but we don't understand why. But when you get into the deeper psychology of why you're doing something, well, now you're understanding, oh, there's something much deeper in this behavior, and it's either trying to resolve something that is deep inside of me that has caused me harm in the past or pain in the past, and I'm trying to resolve that. Or I learned this coping mechanism or this behavior younger, and I'm doing it out of habit. And that habit isn't necessarily serving me well anymore, or it's not a good thing. So by going into the deeper reasoning, it allows you to then unpack it. And oftentimes by going into the deeper reasoning, not just intellectualizing it, but understanding it, it is what allows you to then change the behavior. Because if you fundamentally change the root, it changes how you kind of act from that point forward, which is, I think, a beautiful aspect of psychology, which then, again, gets into mythology.
So we've talked a lot about these ancient myths that have really resonated with both of us. I'm curious to know, are there any modern myths and stories that have really had an impact on you as well?
So for me, probably one of my favorite modern myths, and this goes back to the founding of our country, would be this. Do you know what this is?
Oh yeah, that's George Washington and the cherry tree.
Indeed, yep, that's a rendition of that. So I grew up in Fredericksburg, which is right next to Ferry Farm, which is where technically he grew up as a child, and supposedly where this story occurred. Now, this is a mythology. We know it's a myth because a pastor who wrote his biography shortly after his death just put it in. It's not like he went out and sourced the material and found out about this. In fact, this wasn't even a myth when Washington was alive. But after his death, it was included in the book, along with him throwing a silver dollar eventually across the Potomac River, which is super far. Now, the whole point is that if you don't know the myth, he basically took a hatchet, cut down one of his father's cherry trees, and his father basically comes home and he's like, "What happened to my cherry tree?" And he's like, "I cannot tell a lie. I was the one who cut the tree." So the idea is what is it getting across? It's a myth that gets across that our founding president, our first president, was a very honest person who from the time he was young wouldn't lie about doing something. And so what does that say about our country? Well, what it says is that our first leaders were great people of true character, who, when they got into starting this brand new experiment of democracy, they did it with the best intentions. And also, they had a real moral ethic that then was infused in the rest of the country. And those are the kind of myths that I find to be interesting, because all nations have those on some level or another. All nations have myths of their founding that then promote and uplift and say, we are the greatest nation on earth because these are the people who started us and this is where we came from. And I think that on the one hand, those are beautiful things. I remember learning it. So I grew up in Virginia, obviously right next to this. I knew this myth from the time I was very, very young. It was a common thing in our area. I'm sure even you were familiar with it. It's a very common myth that people are familiar with. So I think that what's interesting about a myth like this for me is that once I realized it was a myth, I also realized how myths are manipulations. Yeah. And that a lot of times when we're thinking about, whenever we mythologize someone, if you hold somebody on a pedestal, and I think particularly if it's somebody you don't know or didn't know, or as a historical figure, you hold them up. and you hear something about them that really stands out as, well, we don't really know if this is true or not, but it's something that was said about him, more than likely that mythology is being used to bolster them, to push them up, to make them seem better than they are. And that is usually to serve a purpose. It's to serve a purpose to make you believe more in the cause of XYZ, whatever that is. So I think that one of the things about myths, besides what we talked about with ancient myths, is something to realize is that there is something manipulative about them. And this is to your original point where you were talking about the myth that really resonated with you. In a sense, that was a manipulation that you bought into that made you a certain way. The same thing with me and Bootstraps. That was manipulative to me, to making me feel a certain way. Was there a positive to it? Absolutely. Was there a negative? Yes, also. So I think that what we have to realize is that myths sometimes are produced as a means of changing our opinion about the world we live in to believe that there is something better out there than maybe what we're seeing in our regular lives.
Absolutely. Well, and I think about the myth of like, that was so resonant for me. That keeps a person quiet. It makes them very easy to be around in a way that often serves people who want to be left to behave however they want. And that is harmful as well. And so the Bootstraps myth ensures that the people that are at the top, that had a lot of help to get there, stay there and kind of promote from within, so to speak. In other words, helping the people that they care about pull their bootstraps up to the detriment of other people. And so these myths, they benefit someone usually.
So I think what we've seen with this is that there are some myths that can enhance our lives, some myths that can detract from our lives. The question I wonder about is, how do we differentiate between the two, and how do we hold on to myths that are going to help us out? Because we need some of those, as we've discussed. And how do we let go of the myths that are actually hindering us?
Absolutely. Well, I think it's interesting in thinking about modern myths, one kind of set of stories that have like a mythical nature to them that have had a big impact on my life because they came out at like just the right age for me is actually like the Harry Potter books. If you've read them, you know that they're rooted in like ancient language and ancient ideas in a lot of cases. And so as I was thinking about kind of a modern myth from them, one that really resonated with me when I was reading the books as a kid and that's continued to stay with me since then comes from the third book, Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. And in that book, there's a prisoner from the wizarding prison on the loose, Sirius Black. And so the prison guards from this magical prison, Azkaban, they are out looking for him. And the guards
are looking for Gary Oldman?
They're looking for Gary Oldman. They're like, this guy is too good. We've got to get him.
He's a great actor. We have to find him.
He can play too many roles too well. We got to get this man off the streets. Exactly. And so they're looking for Gary Oldman. The Dementors, that was what they're called. Yeah, the guards to the wizarding prison. And the way that they work is that when you are around these guards, they suck every good feeling from your body. It's like you feel cold and like you'll never feel anything good or have a good thought or good memory ever again. And so for the main character, Harry, he's seen so much bad things throughout his life that he literally passes out in their presence. It's that traumatic for him. So he learns a counter charm called a Patronus, which calls on the person casting that charm to recall the happiest memory or the most joyful and powerful memory of their life. And that helps to counter that negative force and cast them out. And these are powerful creatures. Like they can literally suck a person's soul from their body. But this warmth and power of a memory or power of the memory of feeling good or having strong experiences of connection, that is more powerful than the darkness. And so that just always really stuck with me, this idea that yes, darkness is powerful, but finding something within ourselves that's positive and that's good, a feeling of love and connection and memory, that is even more powerful. And so I think I highlight that example of a myth that I experienced from a young age to say that I think the reality is, like, myths, I think in the way that we've defined them, we've talked about them as, if something is a myth, there was like a show when I was growing up, Mythbusters. It's something that's really not true. And that's really been the examples that we've highlighted in some ways of, like, this is based on something that sounds really good, but that is not entirely based in fact and reality. What I love about that example is, is there a magical prison? No. Is there really a Patronus charm that can be cast in our world? Not in the literal sense, no. But this idea, this belief that something light and good within us is always going to be more powerful than the dark forces at play in the world, that's gotten me through a lot over the years. And those stories from that book of goodness coming and triumphing over evil, it has been really powerful for me in moments when darkness threatens to engulf everything.
Yeah, so it sounds like what you're saying is that within the myth itself, every myth, if we're talking about it in a literal sense, is false. It's not true in the historical sense.
Yeah.
However, within the myth itself, there are positives and negatives, which was kind of what we pointed out the entire time. And the goal is for you to extract that positive element from it. So, I mean, if we're talking about George Washington, he was honest about, he made a mistake and he was honest. Well, that doesn't necessarily mean that our entire country is honest. But what it does mean is that a sign of a good character is somebody who's willing to be honest when they've made mistakes.
Right.
And they're willing to own those mistakes. And that's a beautiful quality. I mean, that's something that comes out of that myth. And I can tell you that I have taken that idea and I've used it in my life. I don't remember my parents ever really apologizing to me growing up. But I can tell you that something that I've done with my children is that when I've made mistakes, I will always go back to them. I will say, I'm very sorry that I did that. I shouldn't have. I apologize. I was wrong. And I ask for your forgiveness. And what I have found is that it really has shaped our relationship in a way that's so different from the relationship I had with my parents. Because just like George here, he's owning it and he's saying, I did wrong. I, as the adult, do that with my child and say, I own it all the time. And that creates this space of, you're not this perfect person. Mm-hmm. Because I think that kids, they think, well, adults can do no wrong, parents can. And when a parent says, I made this mistake and I'm sorry and I'm going to try to do better next time. Well, it takes you down from being this, almighty figure, and it makes you somebody who's relatable. And as they're making mistakes and they're learning, they're like, well, my parents are still making mistakes.
Exactly.
And so it allows you to have that relationship. So I think within every myth, there is a beautiful part, a beautiful nugget that you can extract for yourself, but you have to do the work to figure out what that nugget is, and then you have to set the rest of it aside and not allow those other parts to kind of influence who you are.
As you were saying all this, like, you came to, at the end, just like an exact thought that I remember. I remember learning this when I was learning about Hinduism, and I took a class that was all about society and the supernatural in Asia, where we were really telling ghost stories from different religious traditions in Asia. And we started the class by introducing this term called, I think it's euhemerism. Mm-hmm. And it's this idea that in every story, there is a kernel of truth. That has stayed with me since that class, because anytime I hear a story, and every day, we hear a million stories, and some of them resonate more deeply than others. But in most stories we see there is a kernel, and sometimes it's the tiniest kernel, but there is a kernel of truth. And so I think recognizing that in any story is really powerful, but also recognizing that we have a choice in determining what stories we allow to guide our lives. I think we can feel like we just have to kind of float and follow whatever story is most important in our society today. Stories of rugged individualism, of taking on more and more all the time to serve some kind of purpose. But we have to kind of embrace the truth in them and embrace that there are truths that go beyond that as well.
I like that. That's a good way. I think that's a nice way for us to end. So I hope that you've appreciated this conversation. I know that there are probably myths in your lives that you subscribe to. And so my hope is that you would tell us about some of those myths, how they've impacted you. Please leave it in the comments. And we hope that this conversation will help you to live your life more intentionally so that you don't allow those myths that maybe have dominated your life in negative ways to consistently push your life forward and down paths that you don't want to take. So we look forward to talking to you next time, and we're going to come back next week for our final episode of the season. So we do 12 episodes every season. We have one more to do, and we're looking forward to seeing you then.